For instance, you start straight, you do something. That could be differential swelling, which is what I'm going to focus on. Differential growth, heating. You can think about bimetallic strips. This can happen in a biological sense with proteins interacting with a cell membrane. And the result of that stimulus is you gain a curvature. Kind of going back to Jose Vico's nice talk yesterday about surface tension and capillarity, if you take that simple problem of dipping fibers into a bath and having water rise and bring the fibers together, if that fluid can induce a natural curvature by swelling, then you see a very different response. So you see the elastocapillary rise. Now the fluid is differentially swelling these fibers on the inside, not the outside. That is inducing a local curvature. And that curvature is causing this beam to bend. And there's lots of interesting fluid structure problems here about how it removes itself from the bath. But this is a really simple way of seeing how dramatic the effect of a natural curvature can be on a structure. There's a lot of examples that are biologically motivated in the spirit of this workshop, in which natural curvature is believed to control the deformation of pollen grains as they are drying out. There's beautiful work done here at Cambridge on the inversion of a volvox in response to a curvature-inducing stimuli. In the embryo stage of development of a Drosophila, you'll see this natural curvature-induced kind of invagination along the outer edge. As I mentioned before, spontaneous curvature, which to me I'm using analogous as a natural curvature, will induce large changes in lipid vesicles and cell membranes. And this is probably a famous example with the snap-through of a Venus flytrap, in which swelling within the leaves induces a curvature change. This curvature stimuli induces a snap-through instability. And so what I want to talk about today is understanding how natural curvature will couple with geometry to induce instability. So I'm going to specifically focus on shells. And instabilities with shells are a really classical problem that have been studied for a long time, often in response to either mechanical loading or a form of pressure. And if you take a shell and you pressurize it, you'll see two different classes of instabilities. If you inflate a shell, this is kind of inflating a balloon, you'll eventually see this kind of limit point instability in which the shell will dramatically expand its volume. Conversely, if you take a pressure and you take a shell and decrease the internal pressure, you'll see buckling emerge, and this is probably the most common example of buckling of spherical shells. You'll see similar types of things happen with curvature. So, for instance, in this case of the volvox, you're seeing an increase in this natural curvature leading to this inversion, which is like a snap-through, so I'll try to convince you of in a few minutes. And this kind of decrease here is leading to a buckling instability. So to talk about shells and instability, we have to kind of formalize what I mean when I talk about using a shell. These are the same equations that were discussed yesterday by Shreyas in his nice talk about the mechanics of the foot. So this is the Kirchhoff-Saint-Venant strain energy, where you have decoupled the strain energy into a stretching and a bending term. I'm going to write these equations a little bit differently than what you saw yesterday, which I'm going to write them in terms of the material properties and their metric tensors. And so your metric tensor A, which is your first fundamental form, is going to describe the measure of local distances on the surface. So how does this thing conformally stretch? If you think back to Areski's talk early yesterday morning. And the second fundamental form, B, is the curvature tensor, which is telling you all the information about local curvature everywhere along the shell. And so if you take these equations and you write them in terms of their A and B, these metric and curvature tensors, you get something that looks like this, which is the same math you saw yesterday, just written in a slightly different form. And I'll just draw your attention that what this is doing is measuring the current state with respect to some reference state, which I'm denoting with a circle there. And that's the thing that I'm going to kind of play with in a second. So curvature does an interesting thing because it's kind of this inelastic stimuli that's not coming from a mechanical source. It's coming from some sort of either internal stress. And so there's been a lot of work recently trying to understand how you deal with residually stressed bodies or bodies that have no stress-free configuration. Should you be measuring the strain energy in your body with respect to some reference state or with respect to some state that would make the object stress-free. And so in this case, your energy changes a little bit. You introduce new first and second fundamental forms. And in this case, this is not referring to the original shell geometry. It's referring to some geometry that's being prescribed by the stimulus. So you do something to conformally stretch it, lambda, or you do something to prescribe a natural curvature, kappa naught, and then you measure your current state with respect to that. So this equation looks almost exactly the same, except I've replaced all my circles with these kind of B bar. And this is basically saying, now let's measure with respect to our stress-free state. I'm going to take this a little bit further and say, there's kind of a nice thing you can do when you limit yourself to isometric deformations. So deformations that do not induce any stretching. So A bar is equivalent to A circle, and it kind of simplifies things a bit. In this limit, what happens is the curvature stimulus that you're adding to your object just becomes additive to the natural curvature of the shell. So your B bar just becomes your original curvature plus your stimulus times your original metric. This is really important because this allows you to do a little bit of algebra and then rewrite that equation that had the non-Euclidean shells with the red variables in it, and rewrite it like this, in which you recover Coiter's stretching energy and Coiter's bending energy, and you have this new term over here. And this new term looks something kind of mechanical, right? This is the elastic energy of the shell. That's okay. And this kind of looks like a potential, right? This is a potential of a natural curvature. So instead of in the pressure case in which you have pressure being work conjugate to the volume change, we're seeing something in which we have curvature, the stimulus of curvature, being conjugate to curvature changes on the shell. This is kind of important because now we can kind of use all the beautiful work that Coiter did studying shell mechanics and instabilities, and now we can kind of do some of those same types of problems using just a different potential. So I'm going to study this experimentally first and then try to rationalize that coming back to this model. The way we do things experimentally is to play with differential swelling. So in all these videos you're going to see pink things and green things. The green things are always getting bigger and the pink things are shrinking. This happens because there's a little bit of solvent in the pink. When you put them together and you wait, there's a diffusion-driven swelling in which a bunch of stuff goes from the left to the right and the green gets bigger. You do this with a one-dimensional object like a beam. And so what happens is, here's your beam. You can't really tell, but this bottom part is pink. This bottom part is green. This top part is pink. You watch the swelling occur, and what you see that is it develops a natural curvature. This is important because this is actually the natural curvature of the beam. This is a measure of the stimulus that we're applying. So you can do a really simple experiment. You can make a bunch of bilayer plates of all different shapes and sizes, and just watch the residual swelling deform them. This is a problem that's analytically tractable. You can take this energy, you can say, well, these are going from plates to cylinders, so there's no stretching, so we can kill my stretching energy, and you can minimize this thing, and the result of this minimization is that you can get that the mean curvature of these cylinders is going to be proportional to some material constant times the natural curvature. And what that looks like experimentally is you take a bilayer plate and a bilayer beam of the exact same thickness ratio. If you measure the curvature of this beam, it says that the mean curvature of this shell should be 1 plus Poisson over 2 times whatever curvature you measure here. And that works really well. This is all data in the case of incompressible materials, and you see that experiments in theory and then computational stuff in blue all collapse on one line. So what happens if you add, I'll pass some of these around for you to play with. What happens if you add an initial curvature? So you start with a shell. So this kind of was a little bit washed out, but this is a spherical cap. And the green is on the outside, the pink is on the inside. And you let swelling take over, and what you see is you buckle into this kind of spindle-like geometry. It's not a cylinder. It looks sort of like a cylinder, but it's not. This is a shape that is isometric to or nearly isometric to a sphere. And this kind of starts to remind you of that pollen grain kind of folding that you see there. I'll pass some of these around for you to play with as well. You flip the You flip the direction of swelling. So you just take your shell now and you make it have a natural state in which the pink is now on the outside, so that's going to shrink. The green's on the inside, that's going to expand. And you do the same experiment. And you'll notice that you don't break symmetry right away. And after a while, you snap. And in this particular case, through the snap-through process, you also lose rotational symmetry. And this kind of snap-through is reminiscent of this volvox kind of reverting itself and turning itself inside out. And what I want to do is put all this, talk about these two phenomena together. And to do that, we need to think a little bit more about that potential that I described before. So here's that potential term again. It's a little bit more complicated now than it was in the case of a flat plate. So what we need to do is we need to take this kind of trace of our curvatures here and expand it out. So this is an expansion to first order in terms of the displacements of the shell, where psi 3 is the normal displacements and psi check is the in-plane displacements. And if you kind of look at this, you see, well, I got like a divergence of a gradient, and I got a divergence here. So that's something that I can apply the generalized Stokes theorem to and throw those things out to and get a bunch of boundary terms. And I have something here that's kind of acting just along the bulk. And so I can take this potential and separate it out into two different works. One work that's acting in a pressure-like way in the bulk of the shell, and one work that's acting in a torque-like way along the edge of the shell. To see what those equations look like here, you can kind of ignore the prefactors right now and just see that you have curvature acting on something that's inducing a normal displacement. That's really similar to what you would see with pressure. It would be pressure times the integral of the psi 3 times over your surface. So this is kind of your bulk term. And you have an edge term, which is going to be curvature times the thing here, which is dealing with the rotation of this edge. And this is dealing with kind of a membrane stress here. And you can really quickly just compare these two works. And what you find is that always the work at the edge of the shell is dominant over the work in the bulk. So when you have an open shell, you're dominated by a torque along the edge. When you have a closed shell, there's no more edge, there's no more torque, so you're dominated by a pressure like in the stimulus in the bulk. So now we can go back and we can kind of put all of those experiments, numerics, simulations, and our theories onto one big phase map in which we see a couple things. So if you start on these gray shells here are your initial shapes. If you turn down the natural curvature and you go from here down to here, once you cross this threshold here, you'll buckle into a shell with a broken rotational symmetry. That's something that looks like this. If you start there and you go up, this is a little bit more complicated. So if you're over here and you go up, you'll just continually bend and bend and bend until you cross this line here. And this is the plate problem, in which case you'll buckle into something that's almost a cylinder. If you're in this region here, which is kind of yellow, but you can't tell, you're going to snap through. You're going to retain axisymmetry. And if you keep going, you keep turning up your curvature, you're going to break axisymmetry, and you're going to turn into this little taco burrito shape here. And if you're beyond this point here, then as soon as you snap, you'll immediately lose rotational symmetry, and you'll buckle into the kind of that spindle shape. I can explain more of the physics behind this plateau and this linear region if those are interested. So this is the kind of phase map of all the behavior you would see for curvature acting on an open shell. Now if you look at a closed shell, it's different. So the first thing you might see is, well, all right, I have a closed shell, so I only have something that looks like a pressure. So I can just look at the fundamental state before I see an instability. And what you would find, for those of you who study pressure buckling of shells, is that before you buckle, the displacement of your shell has the exact same analytical form as the pressure compression of a shell. And so the first thing you might think to do is say, okay, well, if curvature and pressure seem to have this analogous relationship, then I would expect that my buckling curvature I could just arrive at by just going back to the classical relationship for the buckling pressure. And it turns out that this is wrong, and the reason this is wrong is because in the case of pressure, this is a shell that's under a membrane state of stress. Whereas for a curvature stimulus, this is a subtle difference, But in a curvature stimulus, we have both a membrane stress and a curvature stress, and that makes the variation problem a little bit trickier. So this is what Coiter did. Here's his shell energy. Here's the membrane state of stress resulting from the pressure. And now what we're saying is when you have a curvature stimulus, you have to add a term that's accounting for that membrane state of stress. When you do that, you get a different curvature buckling critical value, which works exactly with what our numerical results say. The last thing I want to do is just kind of show you some pictures and pass around some more toys for you to play with and show that this gets quite a bit more complicated as soon as you start to play with things like boundary conditions. So in this case, you have open shells that are being clamped at some distance along their contour. And so I'll pass around a couple of these for you to see. And so depending on where you clamp this and where the curvatures are, you're going to see a lobe increase from 3, 4, 5, all the way up. I think the most we've gotten is 10. If you change your configuration of swelling, and so you're no longer dealing with a curvature-inducing swelling, but something that's inducing a stretch, the problem gets a bit more complicated, and you'll see that instead of maintaining an isometric deformation, you're now inducing a stretch, so you'll see a change in Gaussian curvature, and you'll go from a flat plate to a saddle. And this problem is kind of complementary to the other one, except now you have to deal with your stretching energies. And you can generate a wide range of shapes with a monkey saddle here and a ring by inserting a hole. And you can start to play with kind of locally tuning curvature and start to think of this as like, I'm in an engineering department, so it's, what can we do with it? Can we start to stitch together parts of a surface that'll kind of give you zero Gaussian curvature here and positive Gaussian curvature here and kind of make more complex structures? So with that, I'll take any questions.
You mentioned chiral seed pods, which I find intriguing. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that is not my work. That's the work of Effie Efrati and Aran Sharon and others. And what I think they are showing in that work, if I remember correctly, is that there is, if you basically take those chiral seed pods after opening and you make cuts on them, you can see kind of the state of residual stress that was in that body.
I suppose I was asking a more biological question.
Sure.
What is the biological advantage, if any?
For chiral seed pods?
Yeah.
I do not know. That's I'm not sure. Yeah, I believe.
I speak to a biologist at T.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned the difference between open and closed shells. How do almost closed shells behave, for example, with a small hole?
Yeah, good question. That's a really good question. So you can kind of see that there's a lot that so in the case of buckling, it's different in both cases actually. So in the case of buckling, in which you're putting a negative curvature on there, you get a really different effect than you would see for pressure buckling. So for pressure buckling, you basically have something that doesn't depend on how deep your shell is. But for curvature buckling, what happens is in the limit of kind of 0 theta, you have a plate, and this is kind of the plate solution. And as you go to the right on that graph over there, what you're seeing is there's a competition between the amount of surface area of your shell and the amount of perimeter. And so essentially as that perimeter decreases, you see that the amount of curvature you need to buckle that shell goes incredibly, incredibly high. And so you kind of get this diverging limit as this thing goes to 0. And so I don't know if it ever breaks down, but what we've found is that essentially as you close that shell up, the amount of curvature you need to buckle it is dramatically different. The way we rationalize the snapping shells, as you close that shell, the behavior is also different there. And in both cases, when you have that shell that's almost closed, you need a significant amount of curvature to either buckle it or to induce snap through. And so, but they behave in different ways.
Okay. Okay, no,
So does Volvox actually exploit the same mechanism? If so, what parameter does it
We think
change?
so, yes. I mean, the work on the Volvox, there is a discussion of there kind of being a curvature-inducing stimuli that's causing this thing to revert. Now, and the difference is, and this is where it could be really interesting to study, is we're applying a homogeneous curvature over the whole shell. I believe what's found there is that you have a curvature near the edge. Now what's interesting is that we're basically saying you don't need any of the curvature in the rest of the shell. You really only need that curvature in the edge. And so there's some wild type volvox that will not invert. And so I think it would be interesting to see is there a length over which that curvature is acting that is just not enough to generate inversion, and which can we show that experimentally? And so that's an open question.
Okay, thank you very much again.